In part 2 of chapter 1, we're going to talk about evolution, adaptation, and behavior now. Evolutionary theory is a theory presented by the naturalist Charles Darwin. It views the history of a species in terms of the inherited, adaptive value of physical characteristics, of mental activity, and of behavior. Adaptations are also involved. The physical characteristics, skills, or abilities that increase the chances of reproduction or survival and are therefore likely to be passed along to future generations. As randomly mutated genes are passed along from generation to generations, species change over time. Natural selection is the idea that those who inherit characteristics that help them adapt to their particular environments have a selective advantage over those who do not. Mutations that facilitate survival and reproduction are passed along. Those that do not are not. The survival of the fittest is an idea that species that are better adapted to the environment will survive and reproduce. Here's a picture of old Charles Darwin. He's introduced in The Origin of Species. Darwin's theory of evolution has had a huge impact on how psychologists think about the mind. Different schools of thought reflected different perspectives on the mind, the brain, and behavior. As the discipline of psychology spread throughout the world and developed into a vital field of science and a vibrant profession, different ways of thinking about the content of psychology emerged. These ways of thinking are called schools of thought. Here's a chart of those. We already covered structuralism and functionalism, and we're getting ready to cover psychoanalytic theory, the Gestalt movement, behaviorism, humanist psychology, and cognitivism. All right, for the psychoanalytic approach, the most famous person involved with this, and you might have heard of him, is Sigmund Freud. Much of human behavior is determined by mental processes operating below the level of awareness. This is one of the major conclusions he came to. He used the term unconscious. This is the place where mental processes operate below the level of conscious awareness. Here's a picture of Sigmund Freud. He's the father of psychoanalytic theory. His work hugely influenced psychology in the 20th century. His approach, psychoanalysis, is a method developed by Sigmund Freud that attempts to bring the contents of the unconscious into the conscious awareness so that conflicts can be revealed. Freud analyzed the apparent symbolic content in a person's dreams in search of hidden conflicts. He used free association, in which a patient would talk about whatever he or she wanted to for as long as he or she wanted to. I wonder if he charged by the hour. Contemporary psychologists no longer accept much of Freudian theory. All right, and moving on into behaviorism. The psychologist associated this was named John B. Watson, and he challenged psychology's focus on conscious and unconscious mental processes. Watson developed behaviorism. This is a psychological approach that emphasizes the role of environmental forces in producing observable behavior. The intellectual issue most central to Watson and his followers was the nature and nurture question. All right, here's a picture of John B. Watson. He developed and promoted behaviorism, and his views were amplified by thousands of psychologists, including a B.F. Skinner. B.F. Skinner took up the mantle of behaviorism. His research emphasized how behavior is shaped by the consequences that follow them. Skinner argued that mental processes were of no scientific value in explaining behavior. He wrote the controversial book named Beyond Freedom and Dignity in 1971. Behaviorism dominated psychology into the 1960s. Next up is the Gestalt movement, and it was founded by Max Wertheimer in 1912. This theory is based on the idea that the whole of personal experience is different from the sum of its constituent elements. The perception of objects is subjective and dependent on context. This theory influenced the study of vision and human personality. What do you see here in this image? These fragments make up a picture of a dog sniffing the ground. The mind organizes the picture's elements automatically to produce the perception of the dog. The picture is processed and is experienced as a unified whole. Once you perceive the dog, you cannot choose to unsee it. How many faces do you see? This drawing by the psychologist Roger Shepard can be viewed as either a face behind a candlestick or two separate profiles. The mind organizes the scene into one or another perceptual whole, so the picture looks a specific way each time it is viewed. It is difficult to see both the single face and the two profiles at the same time. Next up is humanistic psychology. This is an approach that focuses on the basic goodness of people and how they become happier and more fulfilled. All right, here's a picture of Carl Rogers. He was the founder of humanistic psychology. According to this school of thought, people are motivated to improve themselves and their lives. Another key figure in this movement is Abraham Maslow. If you're interested, you might want to look him up. Next up is cognitivism. Studies showed that the simple laws of behaviorism could not explain all learning. In 1957, a psychologist named George A. Miller launched the cognitive revolution. 10 years later, an Ulrich Neisser integrated a wide range of cognitive phenomena in his book, Cognitive Psychology. Cognitive psychology is the study of mental functions such as intelligence, thinking, language, memory, and decision-making. There's a picture of George A. Miller. He established the Center for Cognitive Sciences at Harvard University. Computers came along and led to an information processing theories. In the 1980s, cognitive psychologists joined forces with neuroscientists, computer scientists, and philosophers. Started a new branch called cognitive neuroscience. This is the study of the neural mechanisms underlying thought, learning, perception, language, and memory. All right, and that concludes part 2 of this lecture today. Be sure to tune in to part 3.